to be. Like, there has to be more. There has to be
What more do you need than negation? Negating itself. What more, my friend? Okay. So I want to come back to, so that's the truth problematic, and I think we've had a rich discussion of that. We're not going to leave that completely behind. We're about to go into cognition, which is ultimately about truth, right? So we're coming back to it in a different way. But I do want to talk about what he means by logical life and what he means by the logical idea of cognition. We looked last time at life, right? Life is defined initially as a living organism, living individuality. It has these three features about it: sensibility, irritability, and reproduction. We talked about how it reproduces itself both by assimilating the inorganic world. So literally, you could put it as taking in the inorganic world. We would call that in the natural sense eating. And then it reproduces itself. Sexual reproduction looks to be what he's talking about there. But remember that the end of that account is not about, and this is how the animal survives, right? It's not about the living organism in that regard, right? So when we're talking about the concept, which is what we're talking about even in that material, we're talking about the concept as intrinsically proposed rather than extrinsically proposed. Then he says the way to think about that, at least initially in its immediacy, is to think about it as a living individuality. But the ultimate way in which it determines itself there is the living individuality is something that's used by the concept, which is not the individual, but the genus that produces itself and reproduces itself in and through the living organism itself. So you could say then for Hegel that the concept is life. I think that's exactly right. That's what he thinks. So when you're thinking about intrinsic purposiveness for Hegel, it's distinct from extrinsic purposiveness. That's what you're talking about. You're talking about life. But the life here he's talking about, he says, is a logical life. And he admits, we've seen this already, that this looks like something that doesn't belong in the logic. It looks like, okay, we've left behind the logic, now we're into nature, right? At least. And maybe we're all the way into spirit, right? Because this life, is arguably not just natural organisms, but it looks like maybe it's full-blown spiritual organism. So it's some kind of roughly human, divine, whatever kind of organism. And Hegel wants to say, no, it's none of that. It's just life itself. Okay, what's logical life? Well, the key thing he says there to distinguish logical life, and I want to get to cognition in this regard as well, but logical life, he distinguishes logical life from natural life, subject matter, one of the subject matters of the philosophy of nature, and spiritual life, one of the subject matters of the philosophy of spirit, obviously. One of the things that distinguishes them is that, let's just stay with the natural contrast for a moment, because that'll do to make the point, is that natural life is dependent on its environment. This is absolutely crucial for him. It's dependent on its environment. We will say, well, isn't the living organism and the living individuality and logical life, isn't it dependent on its environment? Yes and no. There's a dependency there. It must assimilate the inorganic. It must make use of. So here's this line about the mechanical and chemical being made use of. It's extrinsically purposiveness relationship between the concept qua organism and making use of that life, of that inorganic resources. But it's not dependent on in the sense that it's not beholden to it because it's a feature of it. The organism is not a feature of the environment. The organism in logical life created the environment. So as we know, just think back about the argument at the end of external purposiveness, the end of the teleology chapter. How does that work there? It works this way, right? We make the transition from extrinsic purposiveness to intrinsic purposiveness on what? You can't have extrinsic purposiveness work unless what? Unless that which you're trying to impose or reduce the objectivity to is objectivity has already been created by the concept itself. So that's the intrinsic purposiveness. So that's the line he's still holding on to. He's still saying what makes logical life and not natural is that logical life is an account of the endemic nature, the immanent intrinsic nature of the concept as it is now creating and living off of the world that it has in fact produced, which is not what natural life is. Natural life is pure dependency on something, the environment it did not itself manufacture, create, produce, cause, whatever you want to think about that. So there's this distinction between logical life and natural life. Now, along the way, we might say, well, this looks like the natural intruding on the logical, maybe the logical intruding back on the natural, we can do that kind of thing. But that's the distinction he wants to draw. Now, if that makes any sense, and I always acknowledge that's a difficult one to make, right? That distinction, but that's the crux of it. Then I think something similar applies to cognition. Cognition is not a mental operation. We've been here before with reflection. I see no reason to think that Hegel all of a sudden started saying, and now we're going to do some epistemology. There's just no indication in the text that Hegel's saying, put the brakes on. We've now done enough ontology. Now we're going to talk about how we know that stuff. The way I read cognition is it's the concept. Right? So we haven't all of a sudden left the concept behind and talked about what wonders we have insight into by virtue of the concept. It's still the concept. With what? Now it's not got this impulse to differentiate itself. It's striving to do what? Well, initially it's striving to see itself in objectivity. That's the truth. And that's the elaboration of the analytic and the synthetic modes of striving after that. And then it wants to make that world in itself. That's the good. So that's two forms of striving: theoretical striving, practical striving of the concept. Now, do we strive that way, of course, too? Yeah, we do. So do we have cognition in both those forms, theoretical and practical? Yeah, we do. But is that what he's talking about here? Nope, he's not. He's talking about the cognitional process that's formed the world. And by virtue of that, the world is therefore intelligible to us, or at least is open to our knowing it in that way. So he lays out the ways in which it can be known in that, the analytic and synthetic knowledge thereof, and then the conforming of the world to us by virtue of that. So no surprise here. You didn't think, I don't think, that you were going to come in and hear cognition is where all of a sudden humans or God shows up, right? In the science of logic. It's not. It has been read that way, right? It is regularly read that way in the human sense. It's read as a kind of, oh, okay, here's the retort to the Kantian bifurcation between the two stems of knowledge, right? This is Karen Ng's reading of the cognition chapter. And it's saying now we have intuition that's coming in out of life, and we have concepts that are coming in out of cognition, and how the two match up together. That's what the cognition chapter is really telling us how it operates. So it can be and has been read that way. I just don't see the textual evidence for doing so. I don't see where, as I said, Hegel says, now we're finished doing the ontology of the concept. Let's move on to how we know things by virtue of the concept's work. So let me then say a little bit about cognition from there. Take a look with me. He says this at, this is on page 696. It's right at the beginning of the first full paragraph down on the text. Although the idea, everybody see where I'm at? Although the idea. He says, although the idea is indeed the free concept that has itself as its subject matter. So that's the big claim, right? That this section of the book starts off with. The idea is the adequate concept. That's another formulation of it. Although the idea is indeed the free concept, there's that process, right? Self-determining, that has itself as its subject matter. Related to itself, it's adequate to itself. It is nonetheless immediate, and just because it is immediate, it is still the idea in its subjectivity. So subjectivity always means here not agency, personal, but in the sense of formal. It's still not yet everything. And hence, in its finitude in general, it is the purpose that ought to realize itself of the absolute idea itself still in its appearance. So then he starts using the language of seeking after, striving after. Striving after what? Truth. So what is the idea of striving? No, he doesn't introduce a human cognitional agent in here somewhere, right? He doesn't foist into the analysis all of a sudden, here's some entity that knows things, whether that be divine or human. He just literally, continuing the analysis, says the concept is immanent within objectivity and forms objectivity. It does that by living, right? It's life itself. And that life is not the life of the individual, it's the life of the genus. So it's the genus particularizing itself and thereby realizing itself in singularity. That account that we've seen before, the process of the concept itself. Then he says, so that impulse, the trieb initially, is a streben. It's a striving after something. Striving initially after truth. But what does that mean here? Look at what he says. So right where we left off. What the idea seeks is the truth. Now you want to say, well, okay. What about that bit about where we, always asymptotically approaching something that's beyond us? That's what seeking sounds like. I'm familiar with this, right? I'm always striving after the truth. Where is it going to be found? Look at what he says about it. What the idea seeks is the truth, the identity of the concept itself and reality. But at first it only seeks it, for it is here as it is at first still something subjective. That's why it's seeking it. It's not forbidden from ever finding it. It's not something that exists beyond it. It just starts off by seeking after it. Consequently, although the subject matter that is for the concept is here also a given subject matter, it does not enter into the subject as affecting it, or as confronting it with a constitution of its own as subject matter, or as a pictorial representation on the so it's not all that stuff we standardly think. It's not an epistemological problematic. And that's, I think, a simple way of putting what he's saying there, right? It doesn't show up as an intuition in the content frame, right? It doesn't show up as a sensible intuition that we then have to organize in accordance with our categories. What is it? He says, on the contrary, the subject transforms it transforms objectivity into what? A conceptual determination. It seeks truth. How does it seek that truth? Not by confronting something that's wholly other than it and trying to categorize it and figure it out, but and submitting it, so as a pictorial representation for its own investigation. What does it do? It actually tries to come to conceptual determinations of objectivity. The subject transforms it into a conceptual determination. It is the concept that is the active principle in it. The concept is the active principle. It's what's doing it. This is just like reflection, right, in that sense. So that's what I'm saying, is that cognition is a mental operation term, like reflection is, that Hegel's taken over and said, yeah, I'm going to infuse it not with that subjective, mentalistic, operational language that it has by virtue of its baggage in the tradition. I'm going to use it as an ontological feature of the world. And the payoff of this is going to be something like, because this is what cognition is at the ontological level, cognition at the epistemological level ought to be doing this. That's the message, right? That's what he's trying to lay out. So there is an implied epistemology here, but the project is not epistemological in itself. This is what the cognitive nature, the cognizability, we'll use those words, those terms for it. Cognizability of being is, the cognizability of actuality is. But it's not cognition, the account of cognition itself. It is the concept which is the active principle in it, which therein refers or relates itself to itself, and by thus giving itself its reality in the object, finds truth. Giving itself its reality in the object. So it gives itself to it. It comes through relation to itself. So again, this isn't propositional truth finding, right? This isn't, where you're saying, hey, I bet the mountain's this high. Damn it, it is that high. Damn it, it's not that high. That's propositional truth problematics. Right? That's not what's going on here. Here we're saying reality is, objectivity is, actuality is. Those are interchangeable terms for Hegel at this point. What the subjectivity is itself. It is, in other words, the structure born out of the process itself. He says, initially, therefore, the idea is, here we go, one extreme of a syllogism. The concept that as its purpose has itself at first for its subjective reality, the other extreme is the restriction of the subjective, the objective world. Here we go back to the S in universality mediated through the P. You know where this is going, right? Come on, we've been here many, many times in different domains and different levels, right? So it's not just that's the trick he always pulls, but it's the point of the matter, right? Which is to say, you don't get the singularity united with the universality through the particularity, except for if universality created both sides. You don't get the first figure of the syllogism unless the third figure of the syllogism and the syllogisms of necessity are working this way. So he says, The two extremes are identical in that they are the idea. Their unity is first that of the concept of unity, which is in one extreme is only for itself and the other in itself. Secondly, it is reality, abstract in the one extreme and in the other in its concrete externality. This unity is now posited through cognition, and because the latter is a subjective idea, which as purpose proceeds from itself, it is at first only a middle term. So it's what's getting used in this way. What's the middle term is usable. The knowing subject through the determinants of its concept, which is the abstract being for itself, relates to an external world. Nevertheless, it does this in the absolute certainty of itself in order to elevate its implicit reality, this formal truth, to real truth, the subjective truth to material truth. It has the entire essentiality of the objective world in its concept. That's a huge claim, right? The entire essentiality of the objective world is in the concept itself. It is what it is by virtue of it. Its process consists in positing for itself the concrete reality of that world as identical with the concept, and conversely in positing the latter, and as the concept, as identical with objectivity. So there's the idea of the truth. So how does this actually work? Well, he talks about this theoretical activity of striving in terms of the analytical striving and synthetic striving. So analytical cognition, this is what he's talking about on pages 700 following. So 700 through 706. Analytic cognition. Analytic cognition is where the striving, the impulse, the striving after truth, analyzes objectivity into its basic constitutive parts. It breaks it apart, like analytic knowledge always does, into a set of diverse properties possessing no intrinsic conceptual relations or structures. So it breaks everything down. So the first moment of the process of cognition as the process of the concept is the breaking down of all of the objective world into its constitutive moments. But objectivity itself is a web of interconnections, and thus analysis fails to know objectivity as it is in its truth. So it's not that the breaking down isn't true, it's true. Those are the components. But the components are not just there on their own, they're there in relation to one another. So now we need an account of their relationality. Well, that moves us from analytic cognition to, as he takes up now on page 706, 209 in the German, synthetic cognition. We move from the analytic to the synthetic cognition. And here's where Hegel really bears down and says, look, let's look at this. So he's been very generic and general about what he has to say about the analytic cognition. It's the breaking down of the components of the world into its most basic parts. That's analytic movement of the concept cognition. It's differentiation. But now that differentiation has to interconnect things. That's the synthetic. So what Hegel then does is he talks about three layers of interconnection, from simple to more complex, as he standardly does. That's from definition to division to the theorem. Now, I'm going to walk us through all three of those moments, right? I'll talk you what hopefully makes some sense. But what I want to highlight here is that I think the payoff of this in some respects, and this is 700 pages into the science of logic, so I appreciate why pretty much no one gets here, right? And no one talks about this terribly much, right? I appreciate that, I understand, right? But I think what's about to be said by Hegel is genuine knowledge is knowledge of the theorem. Genuine knowledge of objectivity is to know it in its theorem. It's not just to know it definitionally, it's not just to know it in its divisions, it's to know it in its theorem. Now, the theorem will sound familiar to you when you get there, right? It will be what we highlighted back when we said, oh, look, particularization is not just totalization. It's not just exhaustive particularization. It's also principled particularization. Well, guess what the theorem is? The theorem is the principle by which the division takes place. You don't know something just because you can break it down into its parts. You don't know something just because you can put it back together definitionally and say, well, here's where the divisions are. It's where you know it by virtue of the principle that it's operating by. And that principle is, of course, the movement of the concept. No huge surprise there, but sorry. But that's what's on view here, right? That's what Hegel is trying to assert, that this is the cognitional structure of the world, and that when we implied now, the epistemic side of it. When we do want to know it at its most fundamental level, it's to know it in its theorem side. It's its theorem at the level of the theorem. All right. Now that's going to produce problems. We'll see why when we get there, but nonetheless, that's what I think he's laying out here. So this is 706 to 729. I'm going to summarize this. This is 209 to 230 in the German. So he says, what's the first level of synthetic cognition? What's the first, you've got all this stuff broken down, how you bring it back together, how you start bringing it back together. Initially, the concept brings it back together by taking all these singularities and bringing them together in a universality. Singularity into universality. That's a subsumptive project. Yes, yes. So its objectivity is taken as a set of individual parts, objects, that can be subsumed under a general universal genus. So subsumption is not evil. It's just not the ultimate, end all be all. It's a feature of reality. You can do subsumption, but it's not the fundamental nature. You're at the definitional level. Good for you. But you haven't really progressed to the deeper understanding of the cognitional nature of reality. So it subsumes under a universal genus and thereby distinguishes from one another through their particularities. But definite marks of distinction, definite marks of distinction, specific differences are wholly contingent and thus inessential. So you don't have any way of understanding the divisions amongst things. All you've got is a universal that all these things are subsumed under. You don't really know how they're organized in any kind of way, and they're sorted out what their divisions are. So the next moment is to talk about, well, how does that universality produce those singularities? Universality is now taken to be a set of differentiations, and cognition strives to exhaustively set out all the diverse determinations of objectivity as a whole. The universal divides itself, differentiates itself into its constitutive parts. Ultimately, these can only capture what various objects share in common because it fails to discover the principle of that differentiation. So just think about these two moments. You get lost in all the details, and he's, working through, and you're like exhausted because you're 700 pages in, all that kind of stuff. And you're like, oh my God, what is the world is he talking about? Well, he's talking about synthetic knowledge as part and parcel of the world, not just what we do with the world, but actually part and parcel of the world. The world is breakable down into its constituent parts, analytical. Synthetic, it's brought together initially under a definition, but that's subsumptive. That's just a universality. All these parts belong to this thing, belong under this covering concept. Covering category. Let's call it, being. Vacuous, but not nothing. I mean, it's nothing. But okay, it's not nothing, right? You do know something about things as far as they are. They have that bit of determination about them. But then you want to say, well, that doesn't really account for the nature of reality. That just accounts for how everything is, subsumable under the most generic of generic concepts, namely being. Being, qua being, the most vacuous of all genuses. Quote from somebody. So that. And at that moment, right, Hegel wants to say, right, but that's where universality now divides itself back out into singularity. So it separates, it divides itself into divisions now. Okay, so far so good. Synthetic, subsumptive, synthetic, divisional. Great. Now we got the upflow, if you want to put it in those terms, into the concept. We got the downflow from the concept into the parts. Wonderful, great. What you don't have, of course, is why those parts are divided like that. You just got, a mess has been made. Universality has differentiated itself into this heap, aggregate, clump thing called objectivity. We don't know, because we don't know the principle by which that works. There's the theorem. That's why you can't stop at the definition, can't stop at the division. You got to know the theorem by which it works. So this is universality particularizes itself into the totality that is. That's that second moment. That's division. But ultimately, you have to know the principle of that division. What's the rule governing of that division? So the construction of a theorem is the setting out of the foundation of the relationship between universality and singularity. This is how universality particularizes. This is the rule that governs universality particularizing itself into those singularities that it does. It's to lay down the principle whereby the universal particularizes itself in these precise kinds of individuals. It's principled totalization, to use the term we had all the way back. And this Hegel's already had this, right? It's nothing radically new in that sense. We've heard it before, but there, come on, it was weird. Why is it? What's it doing there? Right? Why are we talking about particularization being totalization? I got that, but why has particularization got a principle to it? Because you don't really, it's not really what it is unless it's rule governed. Otherwise, it's arbitrary. Now, what that puts in, so does that make some sense to everyone? Yeah.
Could you distinguish the divisions and synthetic from the analytic cognition? They seem very similar, but
Yeah, right. So all you're doing in analytic cognition, as I read Hegel, is you're breaking things down into its constituent parts. The difference between that and division, which is what you're asking about, is division is synthetic because it's showing how universality gets particularized out into those parts. So it's not just there's a bunch of damn things, right? It's a bunch of parts of which everything's composed. There are all these entities out there. But now these entities are actually shown to be flow from the differentiation of the particularization of universality itself. So there's a concrete universal at work now. That concrete universality differentiates itself. And now, you're quite right, we get back to singularity, which is what we got in analytic cognition. But now we see that that's synthetically derived from the universality that is particularized itself.
that makes sense.
So that's what was not operative in analytic cognition is operative in synthetic cognition. The missing portion of that, of course, is, and by what rule does it operate? That's the theorem. We good? Now, the theorem, you would think at that point, we're good, we're done, we got the theorem. Truth. And you'll be right, we do have truth. The theorem is truth. But here's the interesting thing he says about the theorem. He says the theorem is the rule governance by which objectivity can be, but also cannot be, what it properly is. It can be out of accord with. Remember, he's used this language before. It can be adequate to the concept, but it also can be disadequate to the concept. So you can now frame that as it could be in accord with the theorem, but it could be out of accord with the theorem. Then it would not be in its truth. Yes? And in that sense, you can talk then about a kind of inherent, Hegel uses the language of fallibility at that point. That things would be in accord with the concept, but also in discord, they'd be in disharmony with, out of accordance with the concept itself. And that's when they're not in their truth. And at that point, of course, as we know for Hegel, that means they're no longer really actual. They're at best appearing, fleeting existence, and at the worst case, nothing at all. So the ontological conception of truth kicks in at that moment to say, okay, but their fallibility is not well, we got things wrong. Not our finitude that's at stake here. It's the very finitude of these objects themselves, objectivity itself. So thus far, the concept has strove to find itself in objectivity. That's what these cognitional processes, analytic, synthetic, are ultimately doing. And the theorem is the height of that. Okay? And it says, aha, I'm caricaturing now. The concept says, aha, that's me. That's what I do. I'm that. That theorem, that principle, yeah, it's me. Okay? So I'm not the parts, I'm not the divisions, but I'm the rule by which all those things happen. That's me. I'm the process that generates all that stuff. That's me. But there's moments of that that are not in accord, or at least it's possible for them not to be in accord with the concept. There's the fallibility of that theorem side. So truth is the pinnacle of the theoretical striving, but it also comes with the price to be paid that it's not everything is going to be in accord with truth itself. Things can be untrue. And what that means is, right, untrue here means that they're not in accord fully with the concept. So what it does at that point, the concept does is said, okay, there's dimensions then of objectivity that could be, notice it's not a necessity, but could be out of accord with the concept, out of accord with me, to use the caricature again. So what does it respond to that by doing? Construct the world in accordance with it. Now it's not striving to know that world, it's striving to construct that world. So now we've moved from what we would call broadly a kind of a theoretical striving to a practical striving. This isn't about truth anymore so much as about the goodness of the world. What does goodness mean? This is talk about things that don't belong in the logic, right? Life doesn't belong. I mean, there's a whole set of things here we could talk. Life doesn't belong in logic. What's cognition doing here? What's truth? Okay, maybe that belongs here. But okay, what in the world is goodness doing, right? And goodness means here something very minimal. No surprise, everything in the logic means something very minimal. What it means here is desirable. It doesn't mean good in and of itself. It's not intrinsic good claims, none of that. You can talk a whole axiology. I had a student one time try to write a whole axiology out of this, right? So you can a whole value theory can be tried to drive out of this. But I think the more minimal claim that I think is true to what Hegel's directly doing here is to say, at this moment in the movement, in the transition from cognition as seeking after truth to cognition as striving after good, the good, is the change of relationship between the concept and objectivity. Initially, the concept had been seeking after itself in objectivity. And with the theorem, it's found itself. There I am. But there are some elements of objectivity that could not be in accord with that. So in response to that, what does the concept do? Try to forge that world, not by decimating truth, but by forging that world in accordance with what's desirable to it. What's the good? So in the practical activity of striving, the aims, the ends, the purposes now of the concept, remember it's a svek, it's a purpose, right? It's an end, are taken to be real and objective, while external existence is understood to be a malleable field within which the will can accomplish its goals. So we have now a kind of, at a higher level or deeper level, however you want to think about it, a reversion back to the external teleological relationship, right? We're making use of, the concept's making use of objectivity for its purpose. So the impulse of life, cognition, seeks to bring the world into conformity with itself by giving it a shape that reflects its own plans. The urge now, the impulse, the trieb, the streben, the striving, is seeking after the good, not the true, the good, what's desirable. Now, Hegel argues on 729. It's a very short discussion of the good compared to the true, right? The true goes on for many, many pages. The account of the good is really, really short. And damn it, if 730 pages into this work, he says, and now we can talk about an ought. Now we can talk about a Zolan, right? Which, back in the logic of being, it showed up there. Remember that moment where, this ought to be other than it is, right? So it's compelled by its own internal ought to be other than it is, and therefore it overturns itself, and thereby it alternates, right? Objects qualitatively, real objects do that by virtue of their own internal constitution that's been limited in some way, and they want to overcome that limitation because their reality is infected with negation, so it overturns itself. There's the ought structure built into, ontologically built into the nature of reality itself, already at that level. And you thought, well, didn't Hegel deal with the ought problem there? I mean, he's a famous critic of the ought. One of the things you can always get out of Hegel is to say, well, he's a critic of the ought, right? Because he's always after Kant, we always say he's always after Kant's formalistic moral theory. Because he wants to say the categorical imperative, the moral law, whatever that is always an ought that you're striving to actualize, striving to realize, but never can do so. But that's your ambition, and that's what be a moral motivation is if you have that as your intent. I guess they're trying to do that. That's what's moving. So Hegel's famous for being a critic of the ought structure of reality, because it looks like it's something beyond that you are striving after outside of you. But he introduces that language here again. He's saying the concept is striving for the world, to construct the world, striving to construct the objectivity in accordance with how it ought to be. Now, of course, the ought here is the concept itself. And look at what he says about this. This is really, I'm going to summarize what he does on 729 and following, so the full analysis and series of steps here. So let me try to take us through, and then I'll focus on a passage in just a moment. So in seeking after, right, that's what it's doing here. It's seeking after to construct the world in accordance with itself. The impulse of cognition takes up its purpose, its end, itself, qua concept, and strives to realize itself in the external world. It tries to bring all that which is out of accord with the concept to be in accord with the concept. That's what would be desirable. That's what the good would be. So he doesn't have a thick, robust sense of the good. This isn't, the Nicomachean ethics showing up in the science of logic, and all of a sudden we're going, what is the good? Glad you asked. Rational activity of the soul in accordance, none of that. He says, but a fundamental contradiction arises. The end or purpose is in contradiction with the existence in which it is seeking to be realized. Well, that's what compelled it to get going. It's not in accordance with the concept. So it's trying to construct the world in those elements that are not in accord with the theorem, so that they'll be in accord with the theorem, they'll be in accord with the concept. So as a result, then, the end or purpose, the concept itself, can be, at this stage, nothing more than the ought. This is how the objectivity ought to be. It's why it's trying to construct it in accordance with. That's the practical striving that's going. So the concept is a practical striving. Now, just like we could say for the theoretical dimension of cognition, you can say there's an implied epistemology. Right? There absolutely is. To know things in their truth is to know them in their theorem. That's the simple thing. But there's a lot of other things you can know about them, like the definition, division, the analytical breaking down of things, right? All that kind of wonderful stuff. So that's the implied epistemology, I would say, laid out in cognition. But here you've got a implied praxeology. Right? We're talking about the concepts. This isn't humans, this isn't divine, this is the concept as such. We're all infused with, everything is infused with the concept. Right? The concept is everything. Literally the conclusion of the book. So, let's claim at the end of the book. So what's going on here? We're saying everything must be brought into accord with it. So at that moment, at that level, to bring everything into accord with it, means it's not in accord with it yet. And if it's not in accord with it yet, then it has things the concept is as things ought to be. So you can say that we strive in that way too as human beings. Our actions are like that. We're striving to know things, or not only to know things in their truth, that's our theoretical striving, but we also have a practical striving. So that's our epistemology. But our praxeology, our practical striving, is to know things such that they are in accord with the good, as they ought to be, where the ought is not extrinsic to them, but internal to them. Better said, internal to us. Hegel does this, by the way, in the philosophy of spirit. This is the account of subjective spirit in its theoretical and its practical dimensions, right? Exactly what this is the ontological undergirding of. So seeking to bring objectivity into accord with the concept thus would appear to be an infinite, futile, because always deferred striving. Here we go. This looks like we're going to have another spurious infinity show up. Oh my God, I'm going to, the concept's going to constantly try to, win over, bring over, construct over things as they ought to be in accord with the concept itself. But here's what Hegel says. Take a look on page 733. Right in the middle of that page. There's always this moment, right, in Hegel where he says, yeah, I see where things are going. We followed that out. We were right to follow it out here. But don't forget this. It's just that kind of, drops it in. Don't forget this. And then it turns out everything pivots on that. Right? So here's where that comes in this account. 733, 235 in the German. That is to say, the activity in the second premise produces only a one-sided being for itself, and its product, therefore, appears as something subjective and singular, and the first presupposition is consequently repeated in it. So there's the activity. We're constantly going to have the world be what it ought to be, but it never is in accordance with that. So here's the second premise. We want it to be what it ought to be, so there's the futile infinity of we're going to approximate it constantly. We're going to seek after it asymptotically, but we'll never get there. Looks like we're setting up for a new version of spurious infinity, now a spurious infinity of the good. But this activity is, in truth, just as much the positing, this activity, the activity of the concept, is just as much what? The positing of the implicit identity, the in itself identity, of the objective concept and the immediate actuality. Now, just like he did at the end of the external teleology, at the end of the teleology chapter, he's literally saying the only way in which the use of something else for something else works is if the something else, here objectivity, has already been formed by the concept itself. This activity, the activity of the concept, is not just this futile, asymptotic seeking after spurious infinity, infinitely going on and on and on, trying to make the objectivity in accord with the concept. This activity is in truth just as much the positing of the implicit identity of the objective concept and the immediate actuality. There's no ought here. Actuality already is this thing. This actuality is by presupposition determined to have only the reality of an appearance, to be in and for itself a nullity, entirely open to determination by the objective concept. This is exactly like what we saw in the extrinsic teleology section, where he says, for the extrinsic teleology to be usable, amenable to the concept had to create it. It's exactly what's going on here. It's a repetition of that same problematic. So, what does that mean to say then? It says that the striving of cognition, what it wants, what it values, and what it seeks after, this practical dimension of striving, rather than the theoretical dimension, namely seeking after the good, must be in conformity with the nature of objectivity itself because, as he's already shown, both objectivity and subjectivity are moments of one process. So there is no genuine extrinsic ought here. Doesn't mean you're not trying to bring objectivity into accord with itself, right? The concept's not trying to bring objectivity into accord with itself. But it's not an infinitely deferred, futile process because that objectivity is the expression of the concept itself. So it's a doable project. Sometimes people refer to this as Hegel's realism. Don't know if I call it that. Doesn't sound very realistic to me, right? But it does mean that there has to be the doability of this, right? That this has to be amenable to, the objectivity has to be amenable to this. So thus volition and knowing, theoretical striving, practical striving, of the concept, though they have different orientations, one to truth, the other to the good, must nonetheless be in accord with one another. What is good must be what is true. They must be the same thing. Hegel says this. This is on 734. Take a look here at the very last lines of the section. He writes this. He says, accordingly in this result, the result that now we've seen that subjectivity, the concept, is what generates objectivity itself. In this result itself, accordingly, in this result, cognition is restored and united with the practical idea. So cognition in the theoretical sense is united with the practical sense. They're one. The previously discovered reality is at the same time determined as the realized absolute purpose. The previously discovered reality, the theoretical, we found out its theorems, is at the same time determined as the realized absolute purpose. It's the good, so the true and the good are the same. No longer an object of investigation, a merely objective world without subjectivity of the subjectivity of the concept, but as an objective world whose inner ground and actual subsistence is rather the concept. This is the absolute idea. Now, that's Hegel's way of saying, look, the concept is this process. The concept is this process of a desire or process, or impulse to differentiate. We've seen that at the level of logical life itself, how that works, because it's the genus that differentiates itself. And we see that here again at the level of cognition, which is a deeper level. Remember, these are retrogressive grounding, so the deeper levels of life are to be found in cognition, right? A lot to be done with that, but that's the claim he's making. And so what we can say from that is that the theoretical striving after the truth and the practical striving after the good are not separable strivings. They're striving after literally the same thing. The true and the good are one and the same. So the knowable and the desirable, to put it in the epistemological and praxeological terms, are one. The theoretical and the practical cognitional structure of reality is one. But notice again what's doing all the work. It's not the concept qua singular. It's universality particularizing itself in and through singularity. That's what the theorem is. And that's what the good is. So that's why he can say, once we've shown that the good and the true are one, that we've now got the absolute idea in its fullness. And then you have this path. So does that make a little bit of sense? there's a lot to be done there. But let me move us to this next page. You didn't read this for today, but I want to use this as a kind of summation of what we've done for today, just to look at it very briefly, and then I'll shut up and we can talk, have some questions and reflection a bit, and then see where we go from there. So he says this is on page 735. Very first lines of the Absolute Idea chapter. You're reading this for next week, so I know I'm talking about stuff I didn't assign to you. But I think it's worth seeing this, right? Because here's one of these moments, as I've alluded to several times. This is the moment that I was alluding to earlier, where Hegel wraps his, poetic about this. So here's maybe a moment where we would say it's not systematic, it's polemical, or it's certainly figurative, poetic, and metaphorical, right? All sorts of things like that. Look at what he says here. The absolute idea, so this is that, sort of what have we got? Stage setting. The absolute idea has shown itself to be the identity of the theoretical and the practical idea, what we just saw. Each of which, of itself, still one-sided, possesses the idea only as a sought for beyond an unattained goal, whether that's truth or the good. Each is therefore a synthesis of striving, each possessing as well as not possessing the idea within it, passing over from one thought to the other without bringing the two together, but remaining fixed in the contradiction of the two. So there's the struggle we've seen, the striving we've seen on both the theoretical side of things and the analytic relationship to the synthetic, and we've seen on the practical side of things in relationship to the objectivity and what it ought to be, the ought structure. The absolute idea is this rational concept that in its reality only relates to itself, rejoins itself, relates to itself. It is by virtue of this immediacy of its objective identity, on the one hand, a turning back to life. So here we have now life in its fullness, the theoretical and practical fullness of the logical sense of life and the logical sense of cognition. So that's on the one side is that. It is equally sublated the form of its immediacy and harbors the most extreme opposition within it. We were told this is what was going to happen, right? That what defines the process is that it always generates its own otherness, harbors its own opposition. The concept is not only soul, here's where he starts to raps poetic. It's not only soul, but free subjective concept that exists for itself. Now, I want to stop there for just a moment because we're about to get to a loaded term. But up to that moment, we should look at it and go, yeah, we don't have to agree that that's what's been attained, but we can see at least that that's what Hegel thinks he's attained by virtue of what he's shown thus far. All right, so that's a good summation. You could say the soul is a bit much, maybe, but this is what drives everything. Is what he means by soul there. He doesn't mean literally the human soul. It's not all of a sudden Dionymos showed up in the science of logic. He really is talking about this is what the animating principle of all things is, the concept, the life. But then he says this: the concept is not only soul, but free subjective concept, free in the sense of self-determining, self-generating, self-caused. Subjective concept, so formal concept, that exists for itself in and through objectivity. And therefore, because of those things, has personality. We've not seen anything like this in the logic up to this point. This is the first time we've gotten anything like personhood, what this means. So then he gives you, as Hegel inevitably does, gives you a little definition of what he means by his usage of the term personality. The practical objective concept that is determined in and for itself and is, as a person, impenetrable atomic subjectivity, but which is not, just the same, exclusive singularity. Well, thanks for nothing, right? Because I thought, let's read through this with me again. The practical objective concept that is determined in and for itself and is, as person, impenetrable atomic subjectivity. Oh, I don't know how this fits, but in this place, I don't get that at all for the moment. But I at least get some of that definition, right? Because that definition sounds like we're talking about personhood, right? Like Kant talked about personhood. Remember, Kant famously said there's only two entities in the world. Morally speaking, there's two entities in the world: persons and things. Persons merit respect, things don't. And he's not the most subtle social ontologist, right? Kant. But, that's his category breakdown on everything that exists in terms of its moral status. Right? So it either is meriting of respect, it either is, humanity, an instance of humanity, instance of the capacity for autonomy, or it's not. And that gives you the distinction between persons and things. And of course, we get into all sorts of arguments about, do animals, which one do animals belong in for Kant, and all that kind of wonderful stuff. Yep, all that. So up to that point, you would go, I don't know what it's doing here, but that makes some sense to me, right? Now we're talking about persons. I don't know why all of a sudden the concept is a person, but that's what it looks like. Well, then he starts to, frustrate you about that. Let's use that kind terminology. Because he says this: the practical objective concept that is determined in and for itself and is as person impenetrable atomic subjectivity. So he's basically telling you, I lifted this out of practical philosophy. I've lifted this term, personhood, out of practical philosophy. I know what it means. I'm not an idiot. It means that. I got it. Then he says, but which is not just the same, exclusive singularity. Well, that's exactly what it had been. Exclusive singularity. This person merits respect in the practical domain. He's just saying it's not that. Right? So at one and the same time, he's saying, here's where I got it, but it doesn't mean that anymore. What does it mean? It's not, which is not just the same, exclusive singularity. It is rather, now, that turn of phrase in Hegel by this point, right? That's him saying, here's the speculative definition that I'm going to be using for this term. Because it is rather explicitly, not this implicit crap, explicitly universality and cognition. Thanks a lot. You just use the term that we have been using, universality and cognition, to define the new term you put in place. So I don't know about you guys, but that's bad definitional practice. Yes? Right? Don't use terms to define other terms that are similarly impenetrable. Then look what he does with it. I mean, we know what he means by universality. It's concrete universality. We know what he means by cognition. It's not human mental operation. It's something about the cognitive striving of the concept to know itself in objectivity as the truth of everything and ultimately as the good of everything in the practical side. We know what those things roughly mean. Then he says this, and in its other has its own objectivity for its subject matter. That we're really familiar with. So what's this personhood? Personhood is a new name for the concept at this level, the concept that has proven itself to be both theoretical. So let me just back it up. The concept that has proven itself to be not only life, but life that is also cognition. Not just universality, not the genus process, but the genus process that is the striving after the true and the striving after the good, in the different ways in which that happens, but ultimately they're one. So it's all one process. And in its other has its own objectivity for its subject matter. All the rest, just amazing, this kind of toss-off line. Everything else is what? Error, confusion, opinion, striving, arbitrariness, and transitoriness. In case you needed some names for it, right? It's all crap. My very reductive translation. Not even translation. Paraphrase. Right? This is the living logic, not the King James logic. The absolute idea alone is being, this is one of these, here's where we got to. The absolute idea alone is being, imperishable life, self-knowing truth, and it is all truth. So, just to continue on with that thought, next paragraph. It is the sole subject matter and content of philosophy. If you ain't talking about this, you're not doing philosophy. You need to stop. I'm sorry to be, a bit elitist, but that's what Hegel's saying, right? You're not talking about the idea, this, which is personhood. What's that? I'll come back and talk a little bit more about that, because that term is really one of the loci for the split between right and left Hegelians, by the way. Right? They split over what he means by personhood, precisely in that passage. But it is the sole subject matter and content of philosophy, since it contains, we're talking about the absolute idea, personhood. It contains all determinants within it. And contains there means, by the way, obviously not subsumptive containment, right? But it contains it as its particularization of its totalization. Right? It exhaustively expresses itself in all this. That's what containment means to mean. All determinants within it, and its essence consists in returning through its self-determination and particularization back to itself. It has various shapes, and the business of philosophy, literally what philosophy needs to be doing. And if you're not doing this, my God, you're not doing philosophy. Is to recognize it in these. At one level, Hegel makes it very simple for you to define philosophy. recognizing the idea in everything. That's it. That's your task. That's what philosophical reflection is all about. Now, I don't recommend you say that in intro class. We need to recognize the idea in all things. What's the idea? Glad you asked. I got a 730-page book that will... That's a disaster. Kevin did not say go into your intro. In fact, I said the exact opposite of that. So please don't walk out of here saying, well, Kevin said we should be teaching the science of logic. No. He then says, so now he's backed out, right? So now he's making meta-level claims about the structure of the system as a whole. Look at what he says. So he's backed out to, this is the subject matter of philosophy as such. So notice, that's not just about the science of logic anymore. So look at where he goes with this. And the business of philosophy is to recognize it, the absolute idea, in all these shapes. Nature and spirit, the next two parts of the system, are in general different modes of exhibiting its absolute idea existence. Art and religion, highest roles in two of the high before you get to philosophy, art and religion and absolute spirit, right? Two modes, he says, different modes of apprehending it, grasping it, and giving itself appropriate existence. Philosophy has the same content. Hegel, this is a standard line in Hegel at this point, right? Philosophy, art, and religion have the same content. Right? They're all about the idea. Now, no artist knows that, no religion knows that. He's fine with that, right? He doesn't think a theologian is really going, this is the absolute idea. Right? That's what, no, right? Thomas doesn't know that. Calvin doesn't know that. Luther certainly didn't know that, right? None of that kind of crap. But he does think that that's what they are articulating nonetheless. No painter knows what they're doing. That's not what you need to be. The artists don't need to know what they're doing, right? To be doing it nonetheless. That's the claim he's making. It is the highest mode of apprehending the absolute idea because its mode, that of the concept, is the highest. Philosophy has the same content, but its mode of apprehension is different. It doesn't depict the absolute idea. It comprehends, grasps, conceptually, begreifen. Grasps the concept itself. Hence, it seizes those shapes of real and ideal finitude, as well as of infinity and holiness, so art and religion, and comprehends them and itself. That self-reflective moment's what philosophy ultimately does, right? Is what makes it distinct from art and religion. Art and religion don't know what they're doing. Philosophy knows what it's doing. That's the self-comprehension moment. The derivation and cognition of these particular modes are now the further business of the particular philosophical sciences. So he's just announced the project of the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, right? That's what this is. This is the first part of that. That's what he's doing. And he says this. Also, the logicality. Now we're back to this book, doing what we're doing here. The logicality of the absolute idea can be called a mode of it. It's a mode of this. So it's like the mode of nature, like the mode of spirit, like the mode of art and religion. All these are modes, modalities, you could say, ways of doing, ways of comprehending, ways of the absolute idea expressing itself in all these different domains, all these different, you could say now, modes. Now look at what he says here. Always, the logic always holds this kind of special role. Here's where you get the special role of the logic expressed initially here in relationship to spirit and nature. Also, the logicality of the absolute idea can be called a mode of it, but mode signifies a particular kind, a determinateness of form. Whereas the logicality of the idea is the universal mode, in which all particular modes are sublated and enveloped. So the logic is part of the system. It's the first part of the system. It's the most abstract part of the system. All those things are true, right? But it's also the most foundational part. Foundational how? Because it comes first? Everything else is derived from it? Absolutely not. That's not how this works. This isn't Hegel's secret first principle, right? The fundamental axiomatic foundation from which everything else is derived. It's not how this operates. You may read it first. You may read this philosophy of nature second. You may read the philosophy of subjective spirit third, because sequentially that's how they flow. That's how the immanent deductive unfolding of them works. Absolutely. That's what we called a few minutes ago the syllogism of being. You can go through that, right? You can read logic, nature, spirit in that sequential sense. But what you'll finally have to see is that the logical mode isn't like the other modes because it is a universal mode, not a particular mode. That's the contrasted way That's the way he draws the contrast between logic, nature, and spirit, those parts of the book, those parts of the system here. He says it's a universal mode in which all particular modes are sublated and enveloped. The logical idea is the idea itself in its pure essence. The idea which is enclosed in simple identity within its concept and in reflective shining has as yet to step into a form determinateness. Has yet to step into a form determinate. We're going to come back to that. That's the movement into nature. But hasn't yet stepped into anything else. The logic thus exhibits the self-movement of the absolute idea only as the original word, a word which is an utterance. It's to put it in slightly different language, the logos. It's being expressed, manifested. But one that is being eternally uttered has immediately vanished again. The idea is therefore only in this self-determination of apprehending itself. It is in the pure thought where difference is not yet otherness, but is and remains perfectly transparent to itself. That otherness language is what's going to come in with nature. So we'll come back to the alterity of nature next week. All right, let me leave it there. There's a lot more to be done with this here because he derives from that why we're talking about now method in this final section. I'll come back and talk about that next week, but I want you to see this kind of rhetorical flourish here at the beginning of this chapter because that's a kind of summary passage. Now let me just say one thing about the personalitate line here and the kind of debate over that and take that where you want to go. So as you can imagine, that language emboldened the right-wing Hegelians to say, aha, the absolute idea is a person, a divine person, God. So that's the way they read that passage. And they said, what ultimately the logic leads to is a theology. An ontotheology, as we would call it, theology. So that's right-wing Hegelians. This is the schools that broke, after Hegel died. This is the two schools that around which things organized. We know the left-wing Hegelians, right? They're famous because they start with people like Feuerbach and Marx and others. We don't know much about the other right-wing Hegelians because, they didn't survive very well, right? But they were quite important at the time. In fact, when Schelling is brought in 1841 to expunge the spirit of Hegel from Berlin, it's the right-wing Hegelians that they're talking about, right? Hegel's not alive. He's been dead for 10 years. But who's around and still in control are the right-wing Hegelians. And so they're saying, the master taught us, right, that the absolute idea is ultimately God, and so theology and philosophy are one at the level of this moment of the absolute idea. So that's how they heard that personality implication of that term. The left-wing Hegelians said, no, we love it. Personality is exactly right, because it's not God, it's us. So when Feuerbach famously says that what we need is to see Hegel's philosophy flipped over, we usually associate that with Marx. It's already there in Feuerbach. Feuerbach famously says, we need to see this. This is in the Essence of Christianity, but it's in the Fire book. It's in, I forget where else it is. That he says, Feuerbach says, we need to see the Hegelian concepts in their humanistic anthropological framework. So when he said personalitate there, he was right. Human persons, not divine person, human person. So we ought to give an anthropological reading. So it's not, the logic doesn't end in an ontotheology, it ends in an ontoanthropology. Just flat out an anthropology, a philosophical anthropology. That's Feuerbach's project in a nutshell. Right? That's Feuerbach's overturning of the idealism that's rampant. The concepts drive everything. And he said, well, concepts don't, people do. Massively reducing much more interesting work in Feuerbach. But that's what's basically there. And that's what you see early Marx, who's basically a Feuerbachian, taking over and trying to work within his own framework. He doesn't stay in that in Marx, but that's another debate for another day. But early on, absolutely working within a Feuerbachian framework. Here's the thing, so there's your right wing and your left wing Hegelians. Yep, they break over that term. I'm being reductive, but that's one way of catching out the debate. Now, what gets left behind in all that is we tend to think about the right-wing Hegelians who are all, right-wing, they're reactionary, they're conservative, they're theologically oriented. Absolutely true. The left Hegelians are left-wing. They're about emancipation. They're about revolution. All that kind of stuff. Yeah. So we tend to think about those two schools that derive somehow or another out of Hegel. Well, it's really out of what do you think the concept is? Is it God or is it humanity? That's the way they were dividing, right? Of course, Hegel said it was neither. That's what that passage has said. Let's be clear. I mean, read the book, get it past the invocation, and he quite clearly says, I know where I got the term. I know how the term has been used, but that's not how I'm going to use the term. So give me my due for how I want to define it like I do. Okay. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. Well, in his own time, Michelet published this, 1841, one of his followers, not a right-wing Hegelian, not a left-wing Hegelian, but a middle Hegelian. We lose these people. They're gone. Right? We don't know what these people are anymore, right? Because they really didn't survive. The other two schools kind of took over for ill and for good or for whatever. But the middle Hegelians were trying to hold this stuff together and say, he used the term personality in a distinctive, unique, idiosyncratic way. And so Michelet, one of his students, famously wrote a book called, the title of which is, I'm going to butcher it, but it's something like Personality of the Divine. And there's a long discussion in there about this term and how it's used here. And Michelet says very clearly, this is not a divine person, this is not a human person, but we can use it to talk about the divine Trinity, which is what he goes on in the book to do, because he's a theologian. That's ultimately where he wants to use it. But he recognizes this is not what Hegel was doing with it. He recognizes the distinction and holds on to the distinction between philosophy and religion. He doesn't collapse them, which is what the right Hegelians have done, what the left Hegelians tried to flip. So I always think that passage is really useful because it's Hegel clearly sort of ratcheting up the rhetoric and saying, look, we're at the summit of everything. This is philosophy. Philosophy's object is this, and its name is personality. And you think, why that term? Because it gets him all this, he thinks. He can infuse it with all that meaning. And it's not completely devoid of that stuff. There's something about, self-determination in personhood. There's something about sacredness and specialness. This is all Kantian notions of that. That's what it means is atomic subjectivity. It's unto itself, right? You have to respect it. You can't violate it. It has all these moral standards. And that's what he's saying about this. This is the foundation from which everything else flows. But he's also saying it's not reducible to the divine or the human. And so I think it's always important to look at that and see where it gets you. And then that's how he defines philosophy. Now, after that moment, top of page 736, he then wants to come back and say, okay, we've been talking about philosophy in general. Let's look at the logical science that we've been trying to work out in this book. And where does that take us? He says it takes us to the logicality of the idea. So we've had logical life, logical cognition, now the logical idea. What's that? Glad you asked. He says right at the bottom of the next paragraph, or the paragraph that comes over from 735. It is the method. And in one sense, this is where things get disappointing, right? Because you're going to find out that the method is nothing other than the beginning, the advance, and the conclusion. Like, doesn't sound like that's not the inventations of the intellect, Spinoza. That's not directions for the, this doesn't really do a methodology. It's not the organon, come on. But Hegel says, what else is there to say? If the concept is everything, then everything must be understood in terms of the concept. That's the way of knowing everything. The method, the way, the methodos, the way we know things. It's got to be down the pathway of the movement of the concept. Otherwise, you don't know it in its truth. So we've been here many, 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 many times, but now we can formalize it in the sense that we can talk about it as a form that's generative of its own content unto itself. And then at that point, we've fully elaborated this determination of being. He says we have reached fulfilled being. That's the kind of announcement of we've now moved all the way from indeterminate, unfulfilled, back to this empty being, which was nothing, to determinate, full of particularization being, fulfilled being. And now, by virtue of that, we must talk about what's other than that. What is other than that? The idea in its externality, nature. We'll talk about that next week. Comments, questions? How could all this possibly be the case? Convinced or worn down. These are not the same thing, remember. You're 20 weeks, almost 20 weeks into Hegel, right? So you're going to have a sense of just, my God, right? It's overwhelming. I've been talking to people recently about their dissertation projects and warning them, don't fall into the black hole of Hegel, right? Because they want to do other things and have Hegel relate to it. It's not so easy, right? Because you get sucked in pretty deep, right? And by the way, if you're not doing this, you're not doing philosophy, so. I don't say that to people, by the way, because that won't make me a popular reader on anybody's dissertation. You're not doing this, you're not doing philosophy. So what you're doing is interesting anthropological reflections. Or maybe not interesting. I said that in class. I didn't say that in a reading. I don't say that in the... Have I ever said that? I don't think I've ever said that in a defense. This is interesting anthropology, not philosophy. I don't think I've ever said that. Yeah. Sorry, John.
Yeah, so doesn't this though help, or could it help explain the seeming digressions then throughout the logic? That is, isn't he entitled then to bring in what otherwise seems to be non-immanent alien content in, if the logic really is a methodology and a general mode?
He's not authorized to bring it in to demonstrate the moments in the progression of the logic. He is entitled by virtue, he's authorized by virtue of this to use that modality, that mode of all modes, the universal mode, the methodology of all methods, to explicate everything else that is. So to me, it's not, I think this is the way I read it. I don't think this is the way I read it. This is the way I read it. I think this is right. That it doesn't authorize him retrospectively to have used all those various other ways of talking about this. It does authorize him proceeding from this to be able to use this method, if you want to call it a method, to understand everything. It's recognizing the idea in everything that exists. So, I mean, yeah, you could look back and say, well, all this other stuff is expressing that. So he's entitled, I get the point, right?
That it is immanent.
Yeah, but I mean, this is just him saying the idea expresses itself in a multitude of different ways, right?
Which are immanent.
And it's immanent to all of them. But has he shown that, has he demonstrated that at that level? I don't think so. So when he uses the free love thing, right, as we talked about, the free love idea, he's not all of a sudden thought he was a 60s on a 60s commune, right? It's not that free love. It's the free love of agapic self unfolding. He would be entitled to that to go into the theological dimension, the religious dimension, and say, oh, this is how God's been depicted in certain religions. And so now we can say the idea has been, we can find the idea there when it depicts itself this way. But he has to earn that by virtue of going through that and understanding it, that domain, that mode. Here it's something he can appeal to for illustrative purposes, but I don't think it does any demonstrative work. There it's doing demonstrative work.
But you don't think that he uses it ever as a way to then prove an otherwise immanent point, right? I think like in the Holgate says that there are times where Hegel uses those examples to prove his point, what could otherwise be an immanent argument. You don't think that's the case?
No, so this is where I've long ago Holgate and I have disagreed about this. That he thinks those can be demonstrative passages. I think they all have to be at best illustrative and nothing more than illustrative. By illustrative, I mean not deductive, right? They're showing, so like when he says the wholes like the state and the church. Well, those are examples he's trying to give you of what he means by truth as the matter of a concept rather than a matter of things. And so that helps illustrate the point, but that's not demonstrating the point, right? It's not deductively establishing anything. It's illustrating what the deduction is purportedly shown. So that's the line I want to draw between those. But yes, I know Holgate will say some passage. He'll say different things about different passages because he assesses them differently, right? But about some passages, he will definitely say what you say, which is this passage is not only illustrative, it's also deductive.
Okay.
Because he can't find a deduction otherwise. I mean, he doesn't find a deduction. Can't find it's a bit much, but doesn't find it. Yeah. So that's what's going on there. I just disagree about how that works methodologically. Yeah, Chris.
I know,
We're over time. If you need to go, certainly go. Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
hopefully this is an easy. It's the same exact question. So I we're going over the shift from the judgment terms to the syllogism.
Yeah,
And I'm going to ask it again here.
Let's do it.
Regarding the transition between life and cognition.
yeah,
Why are we doing it all over again, so to speak?
Yeah.
It seems like we've already accomplished in life this sort of overlapping of objectivity and the concept. I mean, like, it's just the concept of moving through and it's with objectivity. So then why with cognition are we back to wondering or the concept striving?
yeah. So here's the best answer I can give to that, and I don't think it's a satisfactory answer. So let me acknowledge that from the outset, because I think this is a really good question. Back when you asked it about judgment and syllogism, as it is here, I can make the case. I think for syllogisms about the middle term being significant over against the copula and predication. So that's how I'd make the distinction there. Here, I'm going to make the distinction in terms of what does it mean for the genus process to simply reproduce itself through particularization, which is what the account of life is, right? What it ultimately boils down to. And the difference between that and the striving after truth and the striving after the good, which are not the genus simply particularizing itself. It's the genus seeking itself in objectivity, truth, and seeking objectivity to be brought into accord with it, the good. And so it is a repetition, I agree, but it's a repetition that's not the same thing again. It's the same process in both, absolutely. I'm not going to deny that. That's absolutely the case. But the ambition, let me use that term, it doesn't really fit here. The ambition is different than, the ambition is a bit clunky of a term here, but I can't find a better one at the moment. The ambition of the living individual is to survive. For it to survive, it must survive, the species must survive. Now, it doesn't do that. It doesn't plan that, right? That's not an intentional thing that it's doing, but it's what the reproduction of the species does. What reproduction does is it reproduces not just the offspring, it reproduces the species as such. And so it's really the genus that's working its way out through them. So they don't know that, but that's fine. And here it's the genus now doing that same kind of thing, but now doing it about the totality of objectivity itself. It's not just making use of objectivity. It literally is trying to find itself into objectivity and then trying to bring objectivity into accord with itself. That's the theoretical and the practical striving. Is that?
Yeah.
That's about as plausible as I can make it at the moment. Maybe I can make it more plausible. All right, other comments, questions? All right, guys, I appreciate it. I'll see you next week. We'll be doing absolute method, which you've all finally came here to see. We'll be here for absolute method next week. Cool.